Welcome. You are about to enter a house of mirrors. In these 11 fables, you will not find the usual morality tales of clear heroes and villains. You will not be asked to choose a side. Instead, you are invited to bear witness to a simple, brutal truth. The longest-lasting cages we ever know are the ones we build for ourselves. Each of these men and women lived by a singular, unyielding truth. They did not die because they were flawed. They died because their identity, their greatest virtue, became their absolute master. These stories are a unified ledger of human folly. What is the pillar you lean on today? Is it strong enough to hold you up? Or is it simply waiting for the moment you trust it completely, before it crushes you into oblivion? You are warned. Step forward. The earnest man lived his life by a simple, brutal truth: the hammer and the nail. He was the hammer, and the world was full of nails, waiting to be driven home. To him, there was no greater purpose than the honest grind, the steady, unrelenting work that built things, that put food on the table, that earned a man his rest. He had seen what a lack of work could do to a family, a community, a soul. He had seen men wither and die from idleness. So he worked. He worked to build, to protect, to conquer the fear of a world that could, and often did, take everything away. The years turned, and the hammer and nail built an empire, at least in a small way. Arthur's hands, once smooth, became a roadmap of calluses and scars. His back, once straight, carried the slight stoop of a man who had lifted more than his share. He bought the house with the big yard. He filled a bank account with zeros. But with every new acquisition, something was lost. His son's baseball games were a blur of after-the-fact stories told by a tired wife who attended them alone. Her laughter, once a vibrant melody in their home, became a quiet, distant hum, replaced by the silence of a house where a man was always a ghost, physically present, but emotionally absent. On his final day, a Saturday, Arthur woke to a strange stillness. He had a rare day off, a concession to a lingering cold he couldn't shake. He found Sarah in the kitchen, unpaid bills on the counter. "I have to get to the DIY projects," he said. "The fence needs mending. And the porch swing. It's been a while." He looked at her, truly looked at her, for the first time in what felt like years. A flicker of hope ignited in her eyes. "I can help," she said. They worked together, side by side, in a clumsy, unpracticed rhythm, as they were about to hang the porch swing. A simple, small task he had put off for a decade. He felt a sharp, crushing pain in his chest. His last breaths felt like years. The realization hit him with a force greater than the pain. He had built a fortress of security, but he had never laid the foundation. The hammer slipped from his grasp and clattered to the ground. Sarah's startled cry was the last sound he ever heard. The earnest man had worked himself to death, and the only thing he had to show for it was a life he never lived. Silas was born with a hole in his soul, a cavity where a child's innocence should have been. He and his mother had been beggars, a pariah in a world that saw them not as people, but as a stain to be scrubbed away. The mistreatment he endured didn't break him. It hardened him into something cold and impenetrable. He became jaded, a narcissist with a sociopathic streak that manifested as a deep-seated rage against anyone who didn't share his single-minded obsession to never, ever be poor again. Silas's cruelty was a finely honed art, and his masterpiece of destruction was a woman named Sophie. She was everything he was not: beautiful, luminous, sought after. He had been summarily rejected by her, a dismissal that fueled his twisted rage. He launched a smear campaign, a vile assault on her character and good nature. He delved into something darker, a spellwork to tap into her energy, her destiny, her spiritual rights. He sought to siphon away her luck, her opportunities, her prosperity, to steal every monetary blessing that was meant for her. And with the viral nature of social media, their falsehoods spread like a plague. Her world was systematically and cruelly dismantled, and Silas's fortune and influence grew with every piece of her shattered life. But just as Sophie was on the brink of being fully sucked into his darkness, a moment of clarity broke through the haze. She recognized the spell for what it was, and in a moment of desperate spiritual defiance, she invoked the elements to bring about the karmic justice Silas so desperately deserved. The tables turned. His meticulously collected fortune began to bleed away. The people he had coerced into his circle abandoned him as he grew weak and desperate. He died from a heart attack, alone in his empty mansion. In his final moments, he wasn't surrounded by the cold comfort of his wealth, but by a swirling vortex of shadows, the spectral forms of all the lives he had shattered. The man who had lived by collecting money, pain, and the broken pieces of others, died a pauper of the spirit, haunted by the very darkness he had unleashed. Victor was an earthquake in human form, a bully and a womanizer who saw the world as a stage for his aggression. He had never been challenged, not by his sycophantic friends who laughed at his cruelty, nor by the family who had long since learned to keep their distance. He was a man who lived by his fury and believed his invincibility was absolute. Lena had not seen the storm at first. She was drawn to a different side of him, a brief, deceptive calm before the chaos. The peace was shattered one day with a series of deafening threats, words that promised pain and control. In that moment, her view of Victor shifted from a flawed man to a lethal threat. She knew she had to sever ties, and she had to do it in a way that would keep her alive. A plan formed in Lena's mind, a methodical blueprint for survival. She waited 2 weeks, a blur of silent anxiety and sleepless nights, until she was able to lawfully purchase a firearm. She placed his possessions outside her car, more than 10 feet away, a buffer of space between them. She was a woman of precise angles and safe distances now. When he arrived, she motioned for him to retrieve his belongings. But Victor, blinded by his own sense of untouchable power, kept advancing. He reached into the cracked window to grab her. Fear, cold and absolute, seized Lena. In a flash of self-preservation, she closed her eyes, pointed the small handgun, and pulled the trigger. The invincible man was undone, not by a warrior, but by a frightened woman who was finally pushed to her limit. He lived by his aggression, and in the end, he died by it. Cale was a man of steel, a retired military veteran who had traded battlefields for a quiet life of dealing arms. His home was a museum of his life's work. Gleaming swords, meticulously cared for firearms, trophies overflowing with awards for marksmanship. But his war wasn't over. It had merely traded the field for his mind. His PTSD was a ghost in the machine, a silent guardian that kept him on edge, a trigger waiting to be pulled. The most innocent of touches, the most mundane of physical contacts, could trigger the storm within. This was the one weak spot in his armor, the fatal flaw in the warrior's psyche. One afternoon, the fragile peace was shattered at a simple soccer game. Cale bumped into another parent. A shoulder-to-shoulder collision in a crowd. A simple, meaningless accident. But Cale's body reacted before his mind could. He pushed the man away, a look of pure, unadulterated rage on his face. Cale, sensing the danger, walked away, a rare act of de-escalation. But the other man wasn't done. He pulled a gun, a cold, metallic object that Cale himself dealt in, and without a word, he shot Cale 16 times. The seasoned warrior, A man who had survived countless armed conflicts fell in a hail of gunfire at a children's soccer game. He lived by the gun. And in the end, it was the gun, and the fear it instilled in others, that killed him. Morwen was a sorceress of immense power. And to her, magic was a tool for one thing only: personal gain. The idea of karmic debt was a joke to her, a fairy tale for the weak. Her philosophy was simple and brutal. Power was to be taken, not earned, and consequences were for those who weren't clever enough to avoid them. She used her magic with the reckless abandon of a child with a magnifying glass and an anthill. She ruined lives, toppled careers, and amassed a personal fortune through curses and ill-willed spells. But the karmic debt she so flippantly dismissed was not a myth. It was a law of the universe, and its ledger was not so easily dismissed. Morwen, in her arrogance, saw the warning signs not as a warning but as a challenge. She doubled down, pouring more of her dark energy into a grand, final spell. But her power was no longer a loyal servant. It was a hungry monster she had fed with a lifetime of cruelty. Her own magical tools began to turn on her. The cauldron she had used to brew potions of misery bubbled and scalded her hands, burning her with the very hate she had put into it. The spell she was casting turned inward. The energy she had so carelessly wielded became a vortex, a swirling, violent storm of her own making. The magic she had used to destroy others consumed her. The sorceress who had lived by inflicting pain and suffering died consumed by her own hate, a victim of the very power she had used to build her empire. Eleanor was a woman who saw the world through a lens of flavor and warmth. For her, food was not merely sustenance. It was a celebration of life, a comfort in sorrow, and the language of love. She expressed her affection through meticulously planned meals, her joy through laughter-filled feasts, and her solace in the quiet ritual of a warm bowl of soup. She didn't mind the curves, the love handles, the slow expansion of her frame. To her, they were the beautiful byproduct of a happy, well-lived life. The shift from joy to burden was so subtle, so slow, that she barely noticed it at first. The stairs in her house, once a minor inconvenience, became a mountain to climb. The curves she had once welcomed as a sign of a full life began to feel like a prison. Each pound of flesh another bar on her self-made cell. The laughter was replaced by the hollow silence of eating alone. The very food that once brought her comfort, now a source of quiet shame. One evening, as she tried to bend over to tie her shoe, a task so simple it was second nature to the rest of the world, she couldn't. She sank onto the floor, and she looked at the untied shoelace with a sense of profound, crushing defeat. The chapter ends not with her death, but with a more profound kind of tragedy. She was left to live, but her life was no longer her own. She had lived by the pleasure of food, and now she was dying, day by day, under the crushing weight of that very pleasure. Cole was a man for whom the world was a chaotic, dangerous place. His only true salvation, his only source of certainty, was cold, hard steel. He loved his artillery with an almost religious devotion. He saw his weapons not as mere tools, but as extensions of his will, perfect and certain against the unpredictability of a brutal world. His home was less a residence and more a fortress, a place where he could clean, inspect, and organize his collection in peace. There was a weapon for every scenario, a specific tool for every job. He was a force to be reckoned with, and he knew it. The final confrontation came in a tense, silent standoff in a rain-slicked alleyway. Cole had every advantage. He had the high ground, perched on a rusted fire escape. He had the custom-built rifle, A weapon he had poured years of his life into. He had a clear shot, his eye finding the target with the practiced ease of a master. He squeezed the trigger, his finger a perfect extension of his will, ready to end the conflict with a single, decisive action. But in that critical fraction of a second moment, there was no bang. There was only a hollow, metallic click. The gun, his most trusted tool, the ultimate guarantor of his life, had jammed. He died not from a stronger foe or a better shot, but from a single, catastrophic mechanical failure. The man who had lived by his artillery was killed by their sudden, unyielding uncertainty. We have seen the fates of those who lived by a single, unyielding truth. The earnest man, who built a life on the foundation of his hard work, found his final rest in a grave dug by his own exhaustion. The collector, who hoarded a fortune built on the stolen destinies of others, died alone, haunted by the shadows of his victims. The invincible man, the bully who believed his rage was a shield, was undone by a fearful woman who found in self-preservation a strength greater than his aggression. The warrior, a master of arms who trusted his cold steel above all else, fell not on a battlefield, but in a mundane moment, a victim of his own violence. The sorceress, who laughed at the concept of karmic debt, was consumed by the very darkness she so eagerly unleashed on the world. The food lover, who found her joy in pleasure and indulgence, built a prison of her own body, a slow and agonizing descent into a life defined by its limitations. And the shooter, who placed his absolute faith in his arsenal, was killed by the single, sudden failure of the one thing he believed was infallible. Each of their stories is a cautionary tale, a brutal answer to a profound and simple question. What is it you live by? Is it enough to die by? These stories are not just fables of the unfortunate or the cruel. They are a mirror, held up to us all. We see in them not just a glimpse of human nature's extremes, but a reflection of our own passions, our own vices, and our own unwavering convictions. We all have something we live by. We all build a life around a singular belief. The grave does not care if you were the strongest, the smartest, or the most industrious. It only knows that you held on so tightly to one truth, that you became blind to the rest of the world. In the end, it is our most defining quality that often leads us to our final resting place, a victim of the very thing we believed would save us. Julian lived by the logic of the labyrinth. To him, the world was a chaotic mess of human error, and he was the only one capable of tidying it up. He was a master of systems, a man who built intricate digital and social networks that functioned with the cold, silent precision of a Swiss watch. He didn't just plan his day, he engineered his life. Every risk was calculated, every variable accounted for. He believed that if he could just map out enough of the future, he could outsmart destiny itself. He looked down on the emotional outbursts of others, seeing their messy lives as a failure of planning. He was safe, he was certain, and he was entirely in control. The failure began with a single, tiny glitch, a line of code he had written years ago to ensure his ultimate privacy. During a routine software update, a logic loop occurred. The sensors, misinterpreting a spike in atmospheric pressure as a chemical attack, engaged the absolute lock protocol. Julian watched as the heavy titanium shutters hissed shut. He wasn't worried. He was the creator. After all, he reached for his terminal to override the system. The screen blinked red. The biometrics failed to recognize his hand. His palms were sweating, a physiological response to a fear he hadn't planned for. He spent 3 days in that room. The air filtration system, sensing a contaminant risk, began to slowly reduce the oxygen levels. Julian, The man who lived by his intellect died gasping for air in a room that was doing exactly what he had told it to do. Keep him safe from everything. He was a master who had built a cage so perfect even he couldn't escape it. He lived by the blueprint, and he was buried by it. Clara lived by the light of her own sacrifice. To her, the world was a collection of broken things that only she could fix. And every thankless task she performed was a brick in the altar of her own saintliness. She was the woman who never said no. The one who stayed late to finish a colleague's report. The one who spent her weekends tending to ungrateful relatives. The one who wore her exhaustion like a crown of thorns. To Clara, a life of self-care was a life of selfishness. She believed her worth was measured entirely by how much of herself she could pour into the hollows of others, until she was empty. The end did not come from a grand tragedy. It came from the very kindness she had cultivated. One winter evening, Clara felt a coldness in her limbs that no amount of tea or rest could chase away. Her heart, a muscle she had overtaxed with the stresses of 100 lives that weren't her own, began to falter. She sat in her armchair, surrounded by a mountain of laundry she had promised to fold for a neighbor, and a stack of bake sale cookies she had stayed up all night to frost. She reached for her phone to call for help, but her mind hesitated. I don't want to be a bother, the thought whispered, the mantra she had lived by for 60 years. She died in that chair, silent and polite to the very last. When they found her, she was still holding a half-mended sweater for a grandson who had long since outgrown it. The martyr, who lived by the beauty of her sacrifice, was buried under the weight of the very dependencies she had created. She lived for everyone else, and in doing so, died having never truly lived for herself. Elena lived by the heat of the spark, but never the steady warmth of the hearth. To her, love was not a commitment to be nurtured. It was a territory to be conquered. She was a woman of vibrant, magnetic sensuality, a master of the sidelong glance and the unspoken promise. She didn't just want a partner. She wanted a devotee. She fed on the adrenaline of the near miss, the secret text, the electric tension of a room where she was the only woman who mattered. Her power was measured by her ability to pull a man from his orbit, to prove that her gravity was stronger than the laws of loyalty, or the weight of a wedding ring. She choreographed a love triangle with the precision of a spider, enjoying the whispered phone calls and the high-stakes theater of their secret meetings. She believed she was the director of the play, untouchable and supreme, while Julian and Claire were merely actors following her lead. The tragedy didn't begin with a discovery. It began with a transformation. One night, in a luxury hotel room that Elena had picked for its romantic lighting, the play went off script. Julian, pushed to a breaking point by Elena's playful taunts about his boring wife, saw the hollow vanity behind her eyes for the first time. He realized he had traded his entire life for a woman who didn't want him. She only wanted to win him. The woman who lived for the thrill of the hunt became the prey of the very passion she ignited. She had lived by the fire of forbidden desire, and in the end, that fire left nothing but ash. The mirror is now complete. Whether we build our lives out of bricks, spells, bullets, or bites, the lesson remains. Identity without balance is a slow-acting poison. Arthur worked to provide security, but forgot to provide a presence. Silas gathered wealth to escape poverty, but created a poverty of the soul. Julian built a room to keep the world out, only to find he had locked himself in. The grave does not care if you were the strongest, the smartest, or the most industrious. It only knows that you held on so tightly to one truth. that you became blind to the rest of the world. In the end, we are not judged by the height of the monument we build, but by whether or not we can step away from it and still know who we are. The paradox of the pillar, the very thing we lean on to support our lives, eventually becomes the weight that crushes us. We do not fall because of our weaknesses. We fall because we push our strengths into the realm of obsession. We all live by, and will die by, one thing or another. What is it you live by? Is it enough to die by?